hello everyone, and welcome back from lunch. My name is Bliss Chapman, and as he mentioned, I'm here from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I'm super excited to talk to all of you today about generative adversarial networks and some of their applications in cognitive neuroscience. So to give some context to this talk compared to what we've seen so far today, Sage talked about neural networks for brain age prediction. Hannah talked about neural networks for segmentation. Grace talked about neural networks as a way to model cognitive processes. And now I'm going to be talking about using neural networks for synthesis of new data using this framework called generative adversarial networks. All right, so I hope you all had your cappuccino at lunch, because we're going to start with a game, and I need your participation. So one of these rows of faces are fake people. They're generated by a deep learning model. And the other row has faces of real people. And so I want all of you to raise your hand if you think the top row are the fake people. Okay, probably about 20, 30% of you. And now I want you to raise your hand if you think the bottom row are fake people. Okay, there's about 10% of you who don't know what you're doing here yet. That's okay. And it turns out that the top row are fake people, and the bottom row are real people. Thank you. And now we're going to play the same game. So one of these images is a synthetic X-ray, and one of these images is a real X-ray contrast from a radiologist practice in Chicago. And so I want you to raise your hand, again, if you think the image on the left is the real X-ray. Okay, 40%-ish. And now I want you to raise your hand if you think the image on the right is the real X-ray. Okay, cool. Now before I give it away, can someone who picked the image on the left tell me why they chose that? Just yell it out. Is there any particular feature of the image that you noticed or picked up on? Okay, interesting. And now can someone who picked the image on the right tell me why, or tell me anything they picked up on? Okay. All right, so the image on the left is fake, and the image on the right is real. And if you didn't do too well in these games, you shouldn't worry, because you aren't alone. When experienced radiologists were asked to choose which of these X-rays was real and which was fake, images produced by a GAN, by this deep learning model, were identified as real 39% of the time. And notably, there was quite a spread in how successful these radiologists were in distinguishing these real samples from these fake samples. There was one radiologist who preferred GAN images over 80% of the time, and there was another who could identify real images successfully almost every time. And so today, we're going to be talking about synthesizing fMRI data. And so as a final game, let's see how well all of you do in guessing which of these two sets of brain volumes are real. And these are brain contrast statistic images, which are thresholded using whatever the Nylearn defaults are. So raise your hand if you think the brain volumes on the right are real. Brain volumes on the right. Okay, not many of you. And now raise your hand if you think the brain volumes on the left are the real ones. Okay, seems like most of you are sick of this game. All right, congrats to all of you who got that right. In the rest of today's session, I'm going to introduce GANs, which are the deep learning models that generated those synthetic samples. I'm going to discuss how to use GANs to synthesize fMRI data specifically. I'll showcase a few applications of this technology in cognitive neuroscience, briefly mention some challenges, and then finally wrap things up with a tutorial showing all of these concepts in action. So without further ado, let's jump into generative modeling. So mathematically, we can think about a data set of examples, x1 to xn, as samples from some true data distribution, P of x. And in this figure, the blue region shows the part of an image space that with a high probability contains real images. And these black dots indicate our data points. So each of these black dots is an image in our data set. And if that was confusing to you, you can think of an image space as sort of all possible images. So if you were to enumerate pixel by pixel and try every possible value, that would generate all possible images. However, only some of those images would make sense. A lot of them would just be, random noise of some sort. And that part of the image space that would make sense is shown by the blue area in the figure. And of course, then these black dots, which are representing our actual data points, are within that blue figure. And what we want is a model that describes a generated distribution, p hat of x, that is similar to our true data distribution. However, reasoning about these kinds of problems in high dimensions is hard, so I'm going to first review what a generative model looks like in low dimensions to build some intuition. So let's suppose we had a bunch of two-dimensional data scattered around in a grid, and we were tasked with estimating what is the underlying distribution of this data. And we could start by selecting some parametric family. This data looks to me like it's bivariate normally distributed, so that's a reasonable first choice. And then we could simply find the parameters of that distribution that maximizes the likelihood of my data. But why do we care about this? Why is it useful to find the generating distribution in the first place? Well, it turns out that if we can recover the underlying distribution of our data, we're the king of the world. So think back to your intro to statistics class for a moment, and let's suppose you had some distribution of data. Maybe this distribution represents the number of car sales you make in a month, or maybe this distribution represents fMRI scans of healthy subjects. And then your friend comes along, and they bring you a new data point, a new fMRI scan. They might want to know how different from usual is this fMRI scan? Or in what ways is this fMRI scan different from a typical fMRI scan? Or how are two populations of fMRI scans different? Or how many samples would I need to reliably detect a difference between two populations of fMRI scans, etc.? If we know, or if we can estimate well, the generating distribution of our data, these are the types of questions that statisticians have built tools to answer. So on this slide, I show an example of hypothesis testing when our generating distribution is a univariate Gaussian. So given some hypothesis about a new data point or some populations of data, we can evaluate the likelihood of that hypothesis being true using our understanding of that underlying generating distribution. And it's important to recognize that all of these same intuitions hold in high dimensions as well. However, the standard parametric families and their fitting techniques don't really scale well to complex high-dimensional data like brains. So modern techniques use neural network-based approaches like variational autoencoders and generative adversarial networks, which I'll go ahead and introduce now. So if we think back a few slides to our initial mental picture of what a generative model should do, we want a model that describes a generated distribution that is similar to our true data distribution. And a generative adversarial network, again, tries to describe this generated distribution by finding a function that maps from a simple unit Gaussian to the generated distribution. So to sample from my generated distribution, I would simply take a Gaussian random variable and pump it through my neural network, and that's easy. However, notice that I am not defining an explicit probability density function for my data. And this makes computing the likelihood of a new data point very difficult. And so for this reason, GANs are part of a class of models called implicit generative models. They are implicit generative models because they don't explicitly define a density function. Now, how do we go about estimating theta, the parameters of this function that map me from this unit Gaussian to the generated distribution? Well, if I think about this intuitively, what I want are parameters that make my generated distribution similar to my true data distribution. And given a unit Gaussian sample, my learned function, my generative model, can transform it into a sample from the generated distribution. And if I was a domain expert, maybe I look at fMRI images all day, I might be able to look at that generated sample and tell you whether it looks realistic or not. In other words, a generated sample is bad if it is easy to say it does not come from the true data distribution. And similarly, if the sample is good, it is hard to tell whether or not it came from the true data distribution. I'm going to repeat that one more time. So if a sample is good, it is hard to say whether or not it came from the true data distribution. And so the GAN framework captures that intuition by using a classifier to learn a loss function. And this classifier neural network is often called the discriminator, and it is trained to determine if generated samples look real or fake. And so now our two neural networks play a little game. The generator neural network is trained to fool the discriminator, and the discriminator neural network is trained to avoid getting fooled. So if the generator network is successful, then the discriminator network will perform no better than random at determining whether a generated sample is real or fake. So zooming out to see the entire GAN architecture at once, first we draw a sample of random noise from a Gaussian distribution. And then we feed that Gaussian random variable through our generator network to produce a sample from the generated distribution. Then we feed that generated sample to the discriminator, and it makes a prediction, real or fake. Then a loss function is computed for the generator based on how well it did in fooling the discriminator. And similarly, a loss function is computed for the discriminator based on how well it did in determining whether the sample was real or fake. And then both networks are trained with gradient descent based on the gradients of their respective loss functions. Uh-oh. Okay, there we go. And the craziest part of this idea is that it actually works. So here on the right, you can see some pretty pictures generated from GANs. And I want you to remember that none of these bedrooms actually exist. These are all figments of some neural network's imagination. And the success of this technique has made it wildly popular within the ML and AI community, and tons of progress is continuing to be made in this area. Just to get a sense of the hype, here's a graphic showing the cumulative number of GAN papers by month and a sampling of GAN architectures being explored. And this curve just keeps going up. So now that we have a sense of how GANs work, let's talk about GANs for fMRI. In this session, we're going to use the Brainpedia dataset available publicly on NeuroVault. The dataset has around 6,500 statistical parametric maps covering 45 total tasks and 19 cognitive labels. And here's the architecture of the GAN model we'll be using to synthesize fMRI data. So in the orange box on the left is the generator network, and in the blue box on the right is the discriminator network. And they're essentially mirror images of one another. A couple minor points differ from what we've talked about here so far. The first is that because we are synthesizing the entire brain volume rather than just a 2D slice, this model uses 3D convolutions to produce 3D images or volumes. The second minor difference is that our brain data actually has labels indicating what cognitive task was being performed. And so we feed these labels into the generator network along with the random noise. And then the discriminator network enforces that the sample generated by the GAN, or by the generative model, is a realistic sample given those cognitive labels. Okay, so not just a realistic sample overall, but a realistic sample of those labels. And then that signal encourages the generator model to learn to synthesize conditionally based on what label was provided. And the result is the ability to synthesize realistic brain data with user-specified labels. And you can even generate combinations of labels that weren't present in the original dataset. But how do we know if our synthesized data is any good? Well, my first instinct would be to hire a bunch of domain experts to look at it, maybe some of you out there. And that's a pretty common approach, quite reasonable actually, although it gets expensive quickly. And this is also fairly qualitative evidence of how good your data is, and why should I trust the neural network in your head rather, or any more than I can trust, the artificial neural network of the discriminator. I want hard evidence. So if you want quantitative evidence that your synthetic data is awesome, then you have to be a bit more creative. The NeuroSynth image decoder is an open source tool that allows you to quantitatively compare a brain volume to images in the NeuroSynth database. And here, we use it as a tool to evaluate the quality of our synthesized data. So given a brain image synthesized for specified labels, we would like to see high correlation with the analysis types of those labels. Another approach to quantitatively evaluate our synthetic samples is to use a subset of our data to train a generative model. Then use synthesized data from our generative model to train a classifier. And then evaluate that classifier's performance on a test set of real data. If our synthesized training samples are high quality, meaning they come from the same distribution as the real data, then we should expect a classifier trained on those synthetic samples to perform similarly to a classifier that was trained on entirely real data. And in fact, for our model, we see this happening. As we increase the number of synthetic images the classifier sees during training, the performance approaches the accuracy of a classifier trained on entirely real data. And the cool thing about this evaluation technique is it can actually be reformulated as an application of our model as well. So instead of training a classifier only on real data, we can instead train a classifier on all of the available real data, plus as many synthetic samples as we care to generate. And as you can see in this table, this yields performance improvements in our classifier. So some of you may be thinking right now, how is it possible that adding fake data improves classifier performance? And this is a hot research topic right now, but here's one hypothesis to give you some intuition. You can think of the synthetic data as filling in the data distribution between the real data points. And when you do that, it acts as a regularizer of sorts, which improves our classifier's ability to generalize. And notably, traditional generative models, like a Gaussian mixture model, do not have nearly the same success as neural network-based approaches do for these sort of downstream classification tasks. In this table, you can see how augmenting the training set of a classifier with synthetic data from our GAN model consistently outperforms data augmentation from more traditional techniques. Data augmentation is just one use case for this synthetic data. As I mentioned earlier, we can generate combinations of labels that aren't present in the original data set, and some of my latest experiments are actually exploring the idea that maybe we can use synthetic data to determine sample size requirements for new experiments where we haven't even collected data yet. Now, before I move on to the tutorial, I want to briefly mention that these techniques have their fair share of problems. I won't be talking about them in detail here, but I think it's intellectually dishonest to not at least have a slide about them. So if you're interested in diving into the GAN literature, you should be sure to Google these terms or come talk to me after the session. All right, so to wrap up the slide portion of this session, synthesizing fMRI data is exciting, and it's a promising technology for accelerating brain data analysis. The early results are promising, but there is a lot of work left to do in this area. For example, using generative modeling as a tool to explore individual differences in neuroanatomy, extending our techniques to model time series of brain volumes rather than just a 3D snapshot, improving the evaluation techniques, working at higher resolutions, etc. All right, so with that, I'm going to try to jump over to the code here. If you want to follow along, you can follow along by going to the website and clicking on the tutorial, or you can just follow this link here. Okay. All right, so over in the tutorial here, I'm going to start running. The first thing I'm doing here is downloading all the Python packages I need. And then I'm going to unzip them. And then download the data set. This will take not that much time at all because I already did it on this machine. It should take about 30 seconds if you're doing it out there in the crowd. I'm going to unzip it. Okay. Then I'm going to fetch the list of requirements, the Python packages I need, and then install them. And go ahead and import all the packages I need here. So I am using PyTorch, which is actually a different framework than most of the tutorials you've seen so far today. So far, I think you've seen Keras and TensorFlow. PyTorch is another deep learning framework. Fix some random seeds so that the results are the same every time. And scroll, scroll, scroll past the download. All right, so I'm setting up some paths here for where the data will be stored. This data is actually going to be downsampled. So instead of using the full brain volume, I'll be downsampling it to 1/4 of the original size. And I'll be using a batch size of 128. This is a fairly arbitrary selection. It was just made based on how big my GPU memory is. Then I'm going to load my data set into memory. And I'm going to go through the exercise of plotting an example data point. So if you aren't familiar with data science or data science techniques, this is a pretty good practice. Anytime you get a new data set, you should, of course, explore it before you try to apply any of these advanced methods to it. Here, I'm going to do the most basic thing you can do, which is just try to plot out the first data point in the data set. So my brain data has this shape. This is the number of samples in my brain data. And this is the X, Y, and Z. And this dimension here is just extra to make it easier to interface with the PyTorch API. Let me scroll down here. And so here is what an example looks like. And notice that each example comes with a bunch of tags. So in this case, this brain volume is tagged with the cognitive process label calculation, visual words, and visual. And this will be important because remember, we are synthesizing conditionally based on these labels. So when we go to actually train this model, we're going to want to see that we are synthesizing examples that are not just realistic brain images, but realistic brain images of that type. Okay, now getting on to training the model. I'm going to be focusing today on what's been different than what you've seen so far, and mostly what's different than what you've seen so far are the way that the GAN model is trained, because we have two networks that we're actually training simultaneously. All right, so here are the two networks. We have the generator network and the critic network. This is another word for the discriminator network. And again, they're basically mirror images of one another. And again, because I'm focusing on the training process here, I'm abstracting away the exact architecture of these behind these two constructors here. And this model takes a long time to train. So I've actually trained this model for around 200 epochs overnight. And I'm actually going to be loading it in now from a checkpoint. So if you want to do this at home, just know that you should probably have access to a GPU if you want to actually train this model in full. Okay, so I'm going to train it for an extra 5 epochs here to show you how this works. And if you are into math, this is the loss function that the GAN model is actually trying to optimize. There's a couple terms here. Basically, these terms are describing what I told you in the slides. One of them is penalizing the discriminator based on how well it did in determining whether a sample is real or fake. And the other term is basically rewarding the generator based on how well it did in fooling the discriminator. There's one extra term here, which actually comes from the distance function we're using to measure between probability distributions. This is a much more subtle topic. If you're interested, I'd be happy to talk about it in the Q&A or afterwards. Okay, I'm defining some helper functions here to generate noise. And this is the most important function of this session. This is how a generative adversarial network is actually trained. So there's a couple steps. The first thing we're going to do is enumerate over every batch of data in our data set. And then we're going to train our critic, our discriminator network, to distinguish between real and synthetic brain samples. Okay? So to do that, we are first going to generate a synthetic data batch for the specified labels. And we're going to train the critic, right in this line here, given a real data batch and a synthetic data batch, plus the labels for those corresponding batches. All right? That will give us a loss, and based on that loss, we will then train the critic network. The generator network is, again, trained to fool the critic, and so what we do is we gather a sample of noise, feed it into our generator network to get a synthetic data batch, then feed that synthetic data batch into our critic network along with the labels. Then based on the critic predictions, we compute a loss function. That's what you see in this line here. And based on that loss function, we then train the generator network. All right, and then there's a bunch of code here to actually visualize the training procedure. And I'll go ahead and run the training now. So this is just a sample of the full data, so it takes maybe 30 seconds for each epoch. And I'm going to show you one epoch here and then move on to how to synthesize whatever label combination we want. And as you can see right here, this model has already been trained for 241 epochs. All right, boom. Done with the first epoch. There's two separate loss terms, remember, one for the discriminator and one for the generator. and it's going to try to visualize here examples from both the true data, given some labels, and the synthetic data, given those labels. All right, so once again, let's go over here. Here's true visual right hand, or the cognitive process labels. And the synthetic data for those two cognitive process labels looks like this. All right, and there's a whole bunch of samples of these you're more than welcome to play around with. But what I want to do here in my last couple minutes is actually do a quick live coding exercise showing how to sample the cognitive process labels that you might want. So I'm going to jump over to here and grab some code snippets. So the first thing we're going to do to generate a new sample from this network is to grab a sample of random noise. So this could be from a uniform distribution or from a Gaussian distribution. In this case, I'm doing Gaussian. I'll just show you what that looks like. Oops, I gotta stop this up here. Okay, so here's our sample of noise. And the second thing we're gonna do is decide on what label we want to synthesize. So here, in this case, I've decided to synthesize an example of the visual cognitive process. And to do that, I need to get this label into a format that the network can actually understand. And so what I've done here is do what's called a multi-hot encoding. A one-hot encoding, which you may be familiar with, just means that for every type of label, I'm going to represent that as a vector of zeros with a 1 turned on in a certain position. Okay, so as you can see right here, if I turn on the 1 in the 3rd position, that corresponds with the visual cognitive process tag. And all that's handled here in this method I wrote. All right, so now we have our label and we have our noise. The next step is to synthesize a sample from the generated distribution given that noise vector and the encoded label. Go ahead and do that now. And then finally, I want to see what that looks like. So I'm going to visualize that synthesized sample. All right, here we go. So here is a synthetic volume of a brain for the visual cognitive process label. And I might want to go back later and change this to be something like right hand. And if I do that, I'm going to run these all again. So generate a new noise sample, encode that label, and in this case, it's no longer the 3rd or 4th, it's now the 5th. 0 is turned into a 1. I'm going to generate a synthetic sample of that label, and then I'll visualize it once again. All right. Cool. Thank you all very much. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Sorry if I may have missed this, but fMRI data typically evolves over time. Mm-hmm. How does the GAN take care of the time evolution?
Yeah, great question. So in this work, what I've been showing is simply synthesizing fMRI volume at a specific moment in time, so a snapshot. All right? And what I'd like to do in the future moving forward is to extend this to modeling how cognitive processes evolve over time. But that requires different types of networks, like Vince talked about earlier today, like recurrent neural networks and that type of thing. Does that answer your question?
Sort of. So are there recurrent GANs? Does that
yes.
exist?
Good question. So pretty much any type of neural network architecture you can think about, there is a GAN variant of it. So yes, indeed, there's an RNN version of a GAN.
And the models that you were showing, those were individual fMRI volumes, just one acquisition.
Right, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you for your nice, wonderful talk. I'm wondering if it's possible to generate all the true distribution of the data with GAN, with just limited number of fMRI sample data. Is it possible to generate all the true distribution of data?
Well, if the model works well, that's indeed what we're hoping to have happen. So what's happening right now is we're given a true data distribution, and what we want our GAN to do is learn to synthesize samples that we cannot tell whether or not it comes from the true data distribution. So what I think you may be getting at is there's many different noise vectors that you could generate and feed into your network. And actually, instead of sampling randomly from that noise distribution, you could actually sample in very careful ways to produce the kinds of output you care about. So if you really wanted to, you could do something like sampling a wide variety across some Gaussian distribution to see and try to understand what is that latent code really helping you understand about the model. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, I see. Thank
Okay.
you. If I understand correctly, the map that you show is like a Z statistical map. So I'm thinking, is it possible also like to generate like fMRI time volume? It may not correspond to any task or any kind of like resting state network.
Sorry, can you say that one more time? An fMRI what?
Like a volume, like fMRI time point.
Okay, and you want it to be not conditioned based on any respective like cognitive task?
Yes, and also basically similar to the first question that he has basically like you just generate resting state or task fMRI data itself.
Okay, I can maybe try to shed some light on this. We might want to follow up on this afterwards if I don't quite answer your question. So if I were to not feed in these labels that specify the cognitive process, what I would expect to have happen is the generator network should learn to produce samples from all of these different types of cognitive process labels. And back to the previous question, it actually might be the case that different parts of that simple unit Gaussian distribution might end up representing different types of cognitive processes. And they might be actually quite clustered almost in that Gaussian distribution. What was the second part of your question again?
The second part of my question. I think I can follow with you later.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could use the same kind of approach to generate only good quality fMRI data, distinguishing it not from noise, but from some sort of imaging artifact or things like that.
Oh, yeah, good question. So, yeah, very good question. There are a couple papers in that area, actually. One interesting thing about all of these sort of deep neural network architectures for generative modeling is that some of them tend to smooth the output and some of them don't. So a GAN is actually well known for producing sharp, realistic images, but there's another type of deep neural network architecture for generative modeling called a VAE, or a variational autoencoder. And it's been shown that variational autoencoders can actually smooth the output of a data set. So for example, if you have a bunch of images that have some sort of weird imaging artifact and you know what the imaging artifact is in each particular picture, you could train something like a GAN or like a variational autoencoder and penalize it based on whether or not the latent representation, the latent code, the Z variable, the unit Gaussian sample, actually has information about that artifact or not. Okay, so you could think of basically adding on an additional classifier that would penalize our model based on whether or not there's information about that artifact in some layer of the network. And then what you can do is you can say, I want to generate an image with that artifact or an image without that artifact. And so then what you might do is you might feed in an image with an artifact, turn on the switch that says produce an image without an artifact, and see what comes out the other side. And there's been some work in this area. You might want to look into adversarial variational autoencoders or something like a fader network. Those are both good places to start for that kind of approach. All right, thank you very much.
Actually, I got a question.
Oh, okay.
So thank you for the nice tutorial. I got two questions. One might be somehow overlap from the two questions, but I want to make it clear that, to my understanding, the generated images are all like contrast map. It's not raw ball signals. So earlier two questions are somehow Z-score maps, getting after SPM processing. So I don't think the generated one is the real-like fMRI ball signal. That's one question. And the other one is about the GAN training. So one of the challenges in GAN training is mode collapse. So I'm just wondering, how did you handle that issue in training your model?
Yeah, great question. So the first one, I would have to check the details of the data set myself. I don't quite recall. For the second one, I actually have a slide. For those of you who don't know what he's talking about here with mode collapse, let's see if I can show this real fast. It's an important note. So as he mentioned, GANs are susceptible to mode collapse. And what that means is, if you think about what is the easiest way to produce a realistic brain image, what you could do is simply choose one brain image that you know is good. If I was the generator network and I was lazy, I didn't want to do my homework, I would just choose one brain image and then synthesize that brain image over and over and over and over. So rather than capturing the entire distribution of my data, I might just capture one data point and learn to synthesize that one data point really, really well. And there's a couple techniques that are employed to try to resolve this problem. In this model, in this tutorial, I didn't get into any of that, but I'd be happy to chat offline about techniques in that area. So in this figure, you can see the target distribution has a bunch of dots arranged in a circle. And as model training progresses, you can see that the GAN sort of zooms in on just modeling one of those data points rather than all of them. And so that's, the term for that is called mode collapse.